Blue lights washed over the hedges I trimmed every Sunday, turning the neat edges into jagged shadows. Tires crunched the gravel I'd raked flat the night before. The sirens cut out, but the silence afterward felt louder than the noise. The HOA neighbors' blinds lifted like fish gills, one by one, as if the whole street had been holding its breath for this exact moment. I stood at the edge of my front walk with dirt under my nails and the taste of metal in my mouth, trying to steady a heartbeat that refused to be reasonable. I had always believed home was the one place where you could exhale. Tonight, it felt like a courtroom. I had seen the escalation coming in fragments, flyers about mandatory compliance, fines that multiplied like weeds, letters that traded courtesy for threat. It would have been laughable if it hadn't been so relentless. But this wasn't another notice taped to my door. This was the HOA's power arriving in uniform, engines humming, headlights grazing the garage door like a searchlight in a film I didn't remember auditioning for. They didn't need to say anything. Their presence said it all. The board had made up its mind. I was a problem to be removed. It hadn't started with the yard. It started with a boundary, 1 inch here, a line of sight there, a clause resurrected. From a handbook no one read until it was time to wield it. The board's favorite words were non-compliant, unauthorized, and immediate. Immediate removal of a contractor's truck parked for less than an hour. Immediate correction of a fence they suddenly claimed was 2 inches too tall. Immediate payment of fines for unsightly equipment when all I had done was lay out tools on a tarp to fix a sprinkler. The rules changed their shape depending on who stood in front of them. When you asked for clarity, they gave you consequences. So I did what sane people do when faced with a machine that only understands obedience. I documented everything. Photos with timestamps. A folder so carefully labeled it could survive a house fire. Copies of permits. Screenshots of emails that began polite and ended laced with superiority. I learned how to read bylaws the way other people read novels. The words didn't comfort me, but they gave me structure. I needed structure because the board's behavior didn't have any. It was the survey that cracked the surface, a quiet afternoon, a shaded corner of the lawn, a shovel dropped in frustration because I kept hitting something that wasn't rock. The ground told a different story than the paper fencing plan they'd forced me to accept. The soil was compacted in strips, not clumps. It resisted and then gave all at once, like lifting a rug that hides the scuffs beneath it. I pulled up, the first length of it thinking it was old erosion matting. It wasn't. It was something placed there deliberately, a seam in the earth that didn't belong. A line that ran exactly where the HOA said my property line should not. It was almost funny how quickly the sunlight changed color after that. The late afternoon warmth cooled as if the day itself wanted distance from what I'd found. I followed the seam with the shovel, careful, patient in a way I hadn't known I could be. Every few inches the spade ticked against plastic where there should have been soil. I peeled back the second layer and the third. Materials that didn't match. Debris that had no business being under a lawn in a subdivision this new. A pattern emerged, not of nature but of someone's plan, hidden, buried. Meant to stay out of sight until it could be used against me. The first call came while I was still on my knees in the dirt. A clipped voice pretending to be concerned. A reminder about construction activities requiring approval. I didn't argue. I kept digging. The second call was shorter and angrier. The third skipped any pretense at all. I didn't answer either. The ground was telling a truer story than any letterhead. By the time the sun touched the rooftops, I had rolled back enough earth to see it clearly. A manufactured line beneath my yard tracing a boundary that didn't match the survey the title company had given me at closing. A line that conveniently expanded the HOA's control while shrinking my rights. A line they could point to and say, "See, you're in violation," even when the original document said otherwise. When the patrol cars turned onto my street, the dirt on my hands felt like armor. I wasn't reckless. I was ready. The folder sat open on the hood of my car, papers squared, tabs shining softly in the last light. Photos, permits, the original plot. A letter from a city inspector who'd once told me off the record that he didn't trust how quickly your HOA approves revisions. And now, The photos of what lay under my grass, captured from 3 angles, each with the day and time stamped in the clean typeface of a phone that had become my witness. Neighbors collected at the edges of their driveways, careful not to look, like they were watching. You can always tell when a community has been trained by fear. Curiosity survives, but it hides behind hedges. The board had used that fear so effectively for so long that even breathing felt like a risk. But someone always mistakes control for immunity. Someone always pushes one step too far. The officer's boots sounded heavier than boots should sound on a street designed to be quiet. They spoke with the relaxed confidence of people who have been told a story before they arrive. I could feel the script they'd been handed, the roles we were meant to play. I didn't fit their story, and the board didn't expect me to. The HOA thought the uniform would do what the clipboard no longer could. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I pointed to the ground, to the peeled-back ribbons of my lawn exposing the truth beneath the manicure. I showed the folder, orders, plats, approvals, and the clean line where the earth betrayed a revision no one had admitted to. I watched the confidence loosen in the officer's shoulders as their eyes moved from the dirt to the documents and back again. Not an argument, not a scene. Just facts arranged in such a way that the only thing left to do was see them. Shadows stretched long across the asphalt. The streetlights flickered on, one by one, like a slow applause in reverse. The board members who had planted this confrontation watched from porches lit like stages. Faces set in expressions they hoped read as righteous concern. They'd wanted a quick ending, compliance under pressure, a reminder to anyone watching that resistance had a price. Instead, they were about to witness something they couldn't control, the moment a narrative snaps and reshapes itself around the truth. I could feel the neighborhood lean in. Not physically, but in the way the air carried weight. People who had paid fines to make trouble go away were standing still instead of stepping back. People who had learned to keep their heads down were watching the ground instead. The ground that was telling a story they hadn't been allowed to hear. This wasn't about a fence or a truck or a line of sight. It was about the line beneath the lines. It was about what happens when the power that polices you leaves fingerprints it. Can't scrub off. I didn't need them to believe me. I needed them to see it. The photos, the plat, the seam in the soil that shouldn't exist, the timing. The letters that contradicted one another depending on who was receiving them. The way the board's urgency increased in perfect proportion to how close I got to the truth. I didn't dig for revenge. I dug because the ground is honest in a way people sometimes aren't. A breeze moved through the maples and made a low sound like a stadium at rest. The officers exchanged a glance. That wasn't mine to interpret. Somewhere, a dog barked twice and then thought better of it. In the distance, a sprinkler clicked on schedule, indifferent to everything. I took one slow breath and tasted dirt and certainty. Whatever happened next would not be decided by volume or threat. It would be decided by what was buried and what had finally come to light. I had been cast as the problem, but problems have a way of becoming mirrors. The board had ordered a show of force to close a small story. I opened the yard and found a bigger one. And now the question that had seemed so private was suddenly public, printed on earth instead of ink. When the ground under your feet says one thing and the people in charge say another, which truth are you willing to stand on? The flash of a body cam glinted as someone shifted. Pages turned, a flashlight beam crossed the exposed seam and paused there, steady as a verdict. The night was quiet enough to hear the neighbor across the street whisper a single, stunned word to no one at all. I kept my eyes on the place where the lawn and the secret met, because if the first layer looked like this, what would the second reveal? And if this was the line they hid, what else did they bury to make it real? What I dug up in my yard didn't just change the argument, it changed the story. And the moment that beam of light steadied on the truth beneath the grass, I knew we were past the point of intimidation and into something else entirely. Something that could unravel everything the HOA had built on silence. The only question left was how far the roots of this went, and whether the people who planted them were ready for what happens when a whole neighborhood starts to dig. Before the flashing lights and gravel-crunching tires, before the clipboard brigade learned what lives under a lawn when you stop pretending not to see it, this place felt like a brochure. The kind of neighborhood that sells itself with sunrise. Photos, pale gold spilling over cul-de-sacs, sprinklers arcing in perfect rhythm, joggers waving like extras who never forget their marks. I moved here for the quiet and the promise that things worked. Trash days on schedule, holiday flags approved, garage doors that closed with polite efficiency. I believed in that promise because I wanted to. Most of us did. My house sits on a curve where the road softens and the wind always seems to turn in from the lake. The front yard isn't large, but it's mine in the way small places can be. Edges I know by heart, lines I mow by feel. When the sun is low and the maple casts the right kind of shade, the grass looks like velvet that never says a word about being walked on. Weekends belong to simple rituals. Coffee on the porch rail, a socket wrench in my palm while I tuned the mower, a slow inventory of the to-do list that would never quite be finished. Neighbors passed with dogs and strollers. I recognized all, the faces, even if I couldn't always pin their names to them. We traded nods, the universal acknowledgement of people who liked the idea of each other without pressing too close. I learned the HOA rhythms quickly because you have to if you want to keep peace where it can be taken from you. The board posted minutes like a liturgy, motion carried, motion tabled, compliance notes, landscaping budget. An annual barbecue where everyone masked their calculations with potato salad. The president spoke with the tempered smile of someone who thinks authority is its own proof. The compliance chair kept a laser pointer and a binder and the kind of posture that says rules are a monument, and you are a scuff mark they intend to polish out. They were friendly in the way a new pair of shoes is friendly. Looks good. Cuts. Later. At first, the board's interest in my lot felt benign. A welcome packet, a reminder about holiday decorations, a highlight on parking hours I'd never break. But the tone turned, almost imperceptibly, like a pitch only dogs hear and react to. A courtesy notice about a contractor's van outside my place for 43 minutes. A note about temporary exterior equipment when I laid out a straight edge, and chalk line to fix the walkway. The letters were signed with names, but carried a single voice, a confident, placid insistence that compliance was neighborly love, and any hesitation was a personal failing you should be embarrassed by. The first, real rattle came with the fence. I'd wanted a simple run of cedar that matched the grade, and mindfully dodged the roots of the maple I refused to insult with concrete. I submitted drawings more careful than anything I'd sketched since school. The board approved with conditions. A height reduction that clipped the line just shy of privacy. A gentle jog inward to respect the sight triangle. And a flourish about materials that sounded less like aesthetics and more like punishment. It wasn't just the conditions. It was the speed. The approval arrived so fast it didn't feel like anyone had read the survey I'd attached, the one stamped by a company that had measured dirt for 40 years and didn't confuse opinions, with right angles. I complied, because that is how we're taught to keep water calm. I marked the grade and ordered the cedar and stood on my lawn measuring quietly, while a board member passed by slowly enough to read my tape. When the posts went in, I sunk them with patience, because the ground tells you how to do it, if you listen. Still, the notice arrived. A photo of my own fence with an orange circle around a measurement that was correct, a clause about encroachment, review, and a timestamp that told me someone had been on my property when I wasn't there. I rechecked the survey, held it to the light as if truth could be watermarked. The numbers were right. My work was steady. And yet, there was the letter, careful and wrong. If you live long enough under soft coercion, your instincts split. 1. Part of you wants to smooth everything down and apologize for taking up space. And the other part learns to collect proof, as if you'll need it to keep your own name. I started taking photos before and after I did anything outdoors. Not because I wanted to fight, because I wanted to be ready when someone decided a fact could be argued into a fine. The neighborhood itself doubled as theater. Mornings tasted like a commercial, dew lifting, dogs prancing, trash lids closing with soft percussion. But in the late afternoons, the sun angled low and you could see the other layer, where people stopped waving as soon as certain cars rolled by, where trucks, with magnetic logos left quickly, where voices changed color when a board member approached. There were rules for everything that could be seen from a street. The sheen of the mulch, the tilt of a mailbox, the heartiness of a perennial as if plants could be ordered to thrive. The HOA had a word for the look they wanted, cohesive. We joked quietly that it meant identical with better PR. Some neighbors learned to disappear, yard work done at off hours to avoid being seen with a non-compliant tool in a compliant place. Others became fluent in the language of concession, the way you can be fluent in a tongue you resent. You could tell who was tired by who joked loudest. Complaints traveled faster than acknowledgments. You could see it in the lawns, sullen perfection like a teenager who cleans their room because the cost of refusing is too high. You could see it in the eyes of the people who measured from the sidewalk, a glitter that wasn't joy. The president made speeches about community standards that always sounded like they were about love, but always landed like a thinly disguised threat. I am not a crusader by nature. I like the math of a level line, and the satisfaction of work that shows at day's end. But the letters kept coming. A warning for a bag of soil leaning against the house for 2 days. A notice about unsightly equipment when a rake and spade rested on a tarp between tasks. A gentle, patronizing reminder that all construction, defined as anything the board decided made them nervous, required prior approval. Most times I complied to save my bandwidth for the people I loved and the work that paid for the cedar. Sometimes I wrote back with quiet precision and waited for the see-through replies. Always, I filed everything. I learned to hold the rule book, without letting it burrow under my skin. Then came the yellow flyer about boundary integrity checks, a new phrase that arrived like a fully formed law no one remembered voting on. The flyer wore a smiley tone and promised fairness, transparency, and a process to resolve discrepancies for the good of all. It recommended homeowners refrain from personal surveying to avoid confusion. That was the first time I felt the heat climb the back of my neck. A warning the body gives you when someone's trying to move the goalposts with a handshake. I pulled out my closing packet that night, laid the plat flat, and traced the lines with a finger. The boundary was not a metaphor, it was measured. The board could prefer a line, could dislike a line, could vote on a feeling about a line. But they could not move it with a flyer. Life went on because it always does until it doesn't. I patched a crack in the walk, trimmed the maple with respect, taught a neighbor's kid how to sharpen a mower blade without losing a finger. On a breezy Thursday, I set out to reseat a section of edging the frost had lifted. It was a straightforward task, muscle memory, the kind of work that lets your mind fall into a kind of useful quiet. The spade bit the soil and then clicked. Not rock, not root. A hollow sound wrong for this plot of earth. I reset my feet and tried again. Click. Different again. The ground changes voice when it hides something. If you've dug enough, you... No. I peeled back turf like a careful barber around a cowlick. A thin film of synthetic underlayment flashed under the dirt. I'd used materials like it before, but not here. Not at this depth. Not laid in a line that ran too straight to be accident. I slid the blade along it and felt the tug of staples that weren't mine. The layer wasn't erosion matting, wrong weave, wrong weight. Beneath it, a brighter strip of fill that had no business under a yard finished to spec. And under that, another layer. Ground like a bad secret, neat and deliberate. I stood, breathed, looked back at the porch as if it might tell me what to do. Then I fetched the level, a fresh trash bag, my stakes, and the folder. I took pictures as I went. Measurements with witnesses, my own eyes, and the quiet authority of a bubble centered between lines. I worked in thin ribbons, careful not to destroy more grass than I had to. Each ribbon told the same story. Someone had built a false seam in the soil exactly where the HOA's preferred boundary would be if the plat didn't exist. If I were a person who liked ghosts, I would have said I was uncovering one. Once you see the seam, you can't unsee it, not on the ground and not in the way the board had chosen to behave. The urgency that trailed me when I planted the cedar. The email that arrived 7 minutes after I set out a chalk line. The drive-by when I raked pea gravel that needed redistributing by maybe half an inch. It all felt random when it landed because that's how intimidation protects itself, little cuts, plausible deniability. But the seam said otherwise. It offered a hypothesis. The board wanted a boundary and could not have it legally, so they built a counterfeit that would do the job if you never looked below the grass. I could have stopped. I could have called a friend and ranted and put the turf back and told myself the story we tell when we're tired. Pick your battles. Keep the peace. Don't make it worse. I did not stop, because nothing makes it worse, faster than a lie that wins. I kept digging until I had a clean run exposed, long enough to show it couldn't be a patch. When the late light turned my lawn into a map, I set stakes along the seam and set another line along the plat's boundary for comparison. The discrepancy was not a quibble. It was visible in the space you could stand in between the two. The board sensed motion like sharks sense current. The first call hit my phone before the second stake went in. A neutral reminder of processes, then another with a clipped edge. The word violation slipped in like a hook. I took a photo of the screen and turned my ringer off. My heart banged, once, and then settled into a working rhythm. The truth was not going to arrange itself. Evening slid in, shadows stretched long enough to touch. A board member's car angled slow past the curb, braked, idled, continued. I documented quietly. A robin scolded. I apologized out loud and laughed at myself for it. I had the sense of being watched and was. Curtains breathe when someone hides. Behind them, you can feel it in the air. I didn't mind. Stories like this germinate best in public. I am not naive about uniforms. Good people wear them. So do obedient people who haven't been told the whole story. When the patrol cars finally turned into the subdivision, they brought more than authority. They brought momentum. The board wanted speed, a quick show to reset, the power they could feel slipping. They wanted me worried enough to stop. They wanted everyone watching to learn where the line lived, not the measured one, the behavioral one. Don't make us do this. But the setup for what came later wasn't lights and engines. It was the folder on my hood, the plat with a lineage, of signatures, the time-stamped photos of work I did right, and the seam in the soil that showed how someone else had done something wrong. It was the small habits I'd built when the letters started to feel less like reminders and more like entraps. It was the neighbors who stayed on their porches, eyes soft with something like recognition. Because everyone who has ever been talked down to by a polite threat knows the smell of it. If you need to understand a story like this, you have to know that normal life doesn't vanish when the trouble starts. It runs alongside. The lawn still grows. The grill still needs cleaning. Kids still laugh at the same pitch. You don't stop being a person because someone decided to make your property a project. That's maybe the board's biggest mistake. The failure to remember that people live here, not just lawns and lines. They forgot that the ground can tell the truth louder than a letter when you let it. In the days before the sirens, the board accelerated its choreography. In special meeting with a vague agenda. A neighbor who used to wave, suddenly very careful about the direction of their eyes. A new sign at the subdivision entrance about ongoing compliance audits, written in a font that tried to soften its bite. The compliance chair walked the loop twice a day, binder tucked like a hymn book, eyes absorbing details as if they could own them by looking hard enough. I did my chores, went to work, came home, and put my tools away like I always had. I made space in the drawer for more paper. This is how you build resolve without noticing. You pick up a camera when you used to pick up only a rake. You take a breath before you open email. You learn what your yard feels like underfoot so you can sense when it changes. You stand at your boundary and remember that lines weren't meant to be sermons. They were meant to be agreements. I didn't know everything. Then, I didn't know how many layers I'd peel from the soil or how fast the board would try to smother the discovery. I didn't know which neighbors would step closer and which would stay turned to stone. I didn't know whether the officers would arrive with mines made or mines available. But I knew enough to prepare. I knew that whatever lived under that grass deserved to be brought into air. And I knew that when you live in a place that mistakes order for justice, truth starts as a mess. So I set the stage the only way I could, by making sure the story would have witnesses besides me. A line of stakes, a clean run of exposed seam, copies of everything. A yard that looked like a question asked carefully, not a tantrum thrown. The board believed they could define the narrative by deciding who spoke the loudest in a meeting. They forgot that dirt has its own language. In that language, I was fluent enough to keep going. That is the life I had before the blue lights washed my hedges and turned neat shadows into something jagged. A slow, ordinary existence with small joys and measured pride, nudged toward a cliff, by the kind of power that mistakes habit for consent. If you want to understand why I dug, understand this. I liked my quiet. I wanted it back. And there are times when the only route to quiet is straight through the noise someone else makes. When the engines cut and the street went still, my yard was no longer just a yard. It was a page. The board had written on it in secret. I had started to read it out loud. And whether anyone liked the sound or not, the line beneath the lawn was going to finish its sentence. The day after the first shovel strike changed tone, the HOA changed tactics. It was subtle at first, disguised as routine, an email stamped courtesy reminder that read like a verdict, a glossy door hanger about safety and aesthetics, that treated grass like a window display, and an online portal update that slid a new category between landscaping and paint. Boundary integrity. The word felt clean enough to pass unnoticed unless you had dirt under your nails and a seam under your lawn. I had both. I adjusted my life to the pace of scrutiny. Tools returned to their hooks with the kind of ritual usually reserved for sacred objects. Before I pulled a stake or straightened an edge, I lifted my phone, framed the task, and captured a series a claims adjuster would envy. The folder on my desktop sprouted subfolders. Dates nested inside times. Photos sat next to scans of the plat that had followed me from closing to this moment like a quiet, faithful witness. I learned the way afternoon light fell across the yard in narrow bands and used it, letting the seams' texture pop against shadows that remembered where they should be. The HOA's newsletter arrived with a banner about unity and a paragraph about telling our story, the kind of PR lacquer used to shine over rot. In the middle, a new bullet. Please refrain from unapproved digging or personal surveying, which may cause confusion and conflict. I reread the line until it stripped itself of veneer. They were not asking for order, they were asking for the ground to keep quiet. I didn't answer in words. I answered with another measured ribbon of turf lifted, another stretch of false underlayment revealed, another set of photos taken from low and high, near and far, each stamped with the insistence of accuracy. That afternoon, a board member slowed her car again, phone angled low in a move that pretended to be anything but recording. She smiled the way people smile when they want the photo to look civil. The binder rode shotgun, spine cracked in the places rules get used like weapons. She drove on, but the feeling of being catalogued lingered like a film on the skin. I made tea and sat on the step and watched my sprinklers arc on schedule. Control can be borrowed and it can be staged. Water makes no such claims. It obeyed the timer and ignored the stairs. The next notice didn't tape to my door. It came certified. A green card, a signature, a weight that said, "Save this for a judge." The subject line was, "Stop work order regarding unauthorized excavation." The letter itself contained the board's favorite trick, a polite tone wrapped around a threat sharp enough to cut. Immediate cessation, potential fines, law enforcement support, and a phrase that tried to sound like help but landed like handcuffs. "We can resolve this quickly if you comply." I set the letter next to the plat and took a photo of them together as if paperwork could hold hands across a gap and agree to tell the truth. I visited the city's website and downloaded the public records that matched my closing packet. Plats, permits, revisions that wore the city seal, and the patience of people who measure things for a living. They stacked neatly because truth usually does. The HOA's rulebook stacked awkwardly because preference doesn't like to share shelves with fact. I printed the key pages and tabbed them, the boundary lines in heavy black, the easements shaped, like sleep. The note in the corner that said, in the careful script of a surveyor who knows arguments when he sees them, "Reference original monuments." That evening, 3 neighbors drifted by on long walks that stopped long near my yard. No one wanted to be seen wanting to know, but everyone wanted to know. You can feel the shift in a place when the narrative loosens. Lids lift on Tupperware. People take out trash a little slower. Casual errands stretch. Their eyes flicked from the seam to the stakes to the folder on my hood and back again. I nodded the nod of a person who has grown tired of pretending a problem only belongs to the person who says it out loud. They nodded back, then studied the ground the way you study a sentence in a language you half remember. The following morning, the HOA tried ceremony. A special meeting notice posted to the portal in a font that wanted to be comforting. Emergency agenda in caps that wanted to be neutral. The agenda items were vague enough to pass any court of small talk. Community, standards clarification, safety considerations, dispute resolution pathways. The timing was fast enough to make attendance difficult for anyone with a life beyond the cul-de-sac. I screenshotted the notice and added it to the folder. Patterns deserve to be archived like artifacts. Someday someone will need to see how. The story was told while it was being written. I spent the day working cleanly, the seam lengthened under careful hands. I collected samples the way you collect proof of weather. A bag labelled with what lay above and what lay below, tape across the edge to keep the layers in order, a note about depth, a photo of the bag next to the stake that had been nearest at the moment of removal. It felt obsessive, and it was, but obsession is a fine tool when the other side's currency is ambiguity. Late in the afternoon, an email pinged from an address I hadn't seen before, Architectural Review, with a request for immediate site access to assess safety concerns. The phrasing carried a whiff of something freshly minted, like a title someone had given themselves between lunch and audacity. I checked the covenants and found the committee listed, yes, but stripped of the authority the email implied. They could recommend, they could not seize. They could visit if invited or if an independent safety authority did the asking. I did not invite. I replied with a scan of the plat and a copy of the city's guidance, polite as a fence line. By Bison, in dusk, the street had grown eyes. A pair of unfamiliar sedans cruised with the kind of slowness that feigns benign curiosity and convinces no one. Porch lights clicked on in a staggered pattern. The air tasted like a storm that might pass if everyone stayed inside. I stayed outside. The grass I had peeled back lay folded like a page. The page read like an admission someone hadn't meant to publish. I knew enough now to recognize the strategy. Overwhelm. A cascade of notices. A pop-up meeting. An invented urgency that tries to make your preparation feel like an aggression. I exhaled slowly and watered the exposed subsoil lightly so it wouldn't dry into a brittle testimony. Even the ground tells its story better when it isn't thirsty. The special meeting unfolded in the hall at the end of the cul-de-sac beneath, fluorescent lights that have never flattered anyone's intentions. I stood in the back because back is where you can see both the stage and the exit. The president wore the smile again. The compliance chair adopted a tone that made the word community sound like a command. They spoke of safety as if a measured trench were a sinkhole, of aesthetics as if honesty were tacky, of process as if process had ever been a substitute for fairness. The new phrase, law enforcement partnership, made its debut, escorted by a sentence about de-escalation that betrayed how much escalation they had already imagined. They put up slides, lawns from brochures, fences from catalogues, diagrams with arrows that curved around facts. They never named me. They didn't have to. Everyone knew which yard had turned into a page. A neighbor asked a question shaped like a compliment, addressing no one and everyone. We all value safety, right? Heads bobbed. Another neighbor practiced the art of riskless participation, telling a story about a dog that had once tripped in a different subdivision, the image of danger soft enough to slide past dissent. The board nodded solemnly as if gravity had been invented 3 minutes ago and they had thought of it first. When they opened the floor, the rules changed mid-sentence. Time limits for the wrong voices, extensions for the right ones. Calls to stay positive when a point landed with more wait than welcome. The compliance chair's binder sat open to a page that looked like a checklist for how to steer a room without appearing to move. I didn't speak. Not because I had nothing to say, but because the ground at home was saying it better and would be there when the fluorescent lights went dark and people remembered what authenticity feels like. The next morning, the HOA escalated from paper to presence. A contractor's truck parked 2 houses down with men in reflective vests who stared, too long at my stakes to be blasé. They measured the air with their eyes in a way only people looking for permission do. One of them ran a hand along the fence as if it could tell him who paid for the wood. The compliance chair made 2 circuits of the block on foot, glancing at watches when the only time that mattered was the history under the sod. The board president chose the long way out of the neighborhood and took it twice. None of them crossed onto my property. None of them had the standing to do it, and they knew it. Still, their orbit tightened, a performance of proximity designed to make a person second-guess their rights. By lunch, a new letter had landed. Notice of potential lien. It was worded carefully because it had to be. The law is not the board's playground, even when they think otherwise. The notice listed fines accumulated through the alchemy of committee votes and stern fonts. It threatened the future with the bureaucratic equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Further action may be necessary. I added it to the stack. Threats don't grow less dangerous when you archive them, but they do grow more legible. I called the title company and requested a reissue of the plat files with metadata intact. I called the city and asked for public comment protocols on HOA conducted enforcement colliding with municipal standards. I filled out a request for the record of any law enforcement partnership the board had invoked like a talisman. If it existed, it would wear a stamp. If it didn't, the absence would be noisy. I logged each call, each email, each name, each time. Preparation is not paranoia when the other side is counting on you to tire and fold. In the late afternoon, the sky went that pale, high white that bleaches color from everything and reveals edges. I returned to the yard and worked the next section of seam. The underlayment came up with a reluctant sigh, the kind man-made materials give when they realize they have been found. Beneath it, the fill line ran straight and wrong, a bright strip of imported certainty in a place that should have been messier. I laid a measuring tape across the gap between their line and the true one, and photographed the distance as if it were a portrait. The numbers looked like numbers do when they can't be argued with. I felt my shoulders lower and my breath come longer. The ground had moved from suspicion to confession. A car I recognized as a neighbor's rolled by and stopped. The driver didn't get out. He looked at the seam, then at me, then at the folder, then away. I could see the calculation. Job, mortgage, schedule, children, holidays, grill, his life, stacked neatly in the balance. He lifted 2 fingers in a small salute that carried the weight of someone who had paid his share of small, unfair invoices to keep the peace. He drove on. Not because he didn't care, because caring costs, and he wasn't sure he could afford the price the board would set for him. I took a break and stood in the garage doorway where cool air pools in the shade. The binder I'd assembled now felt like a spine I could rely on. Inside, the city code sections printed crisp, the plat enlarged for clarity. The HOA's own rules, annotated with the places they had overreached. The certified letters envelope, my green signature card. Each photo labeled with enough context that no one could claim the scene had been staged after the fact. I knew what would come next because power is rarely inventive. When paper doesn't work, show a uniform. When a claim can't hold in daylight, bring lights. Evening fell with the kind of quiet that pretends to be neutral and isn't. The board's cars disappeared, then reappeared with different drivers and different speeds. A neighbor watered a flower bed that didn't need it. Children played with an attentiveness they reserve for adult drama. Somewhere the soft pop of a bottle cap in a kitchen. Somewhere else, the hush of a TV turned down low. I turned on the porch light and left the garage door open enough to signal that I was not hiding. And not inviting. The line between those two is thin and necessary. The email from the HOA portal chimed just as the first star showed. Final warning prior to enforcement. The timestamp mattered because timestamps always do. It was late enough to excuse anything that happened fast and early enough to claim you'd tried restraint. The message contained a sentence that had been drafted long before it arrived. If you do not cease immediately, we will request assistance. Assistance carries many shapes. Tonight, it would wear reflective stripes and the authority of people, who assume the call that summoned them is a full story and not a selected scene. I walked to the edge of the trench and looked down. The seam lay exposed like a lie that had forgotten its alibi. I set the stakes in a tighter run along both lines, the counterfeit and the true, and linked them with string like a diagram you could walk through. I placed the plat on the hood again and set a flashlight beside it, batteries fresh, beam strong, because if there's one thing a story like this requires, it's good light at the right moment. I laid the certified letter next to the plan like a before and after. I called no one. I didn't need a crowd to feel brave. I needed the ground and the paper and a calm that does not register on a decibel meter. The neighborhood's rhythm slowed to the pace of waiting. You could feel the collective body hold itself at the hinge between normal and not, then the low hum, familiar and unwelcome. Engines approaching that did not belong to residents, red and blue slanting off mirrors before the vehicles turned the corner, the kind of timing that announces itself as inevitability. The patrol cars rolled in with the confidence of uniforms that have been told they are arriving to restore order. They idled at angles, lines drawn by people who practice drawing lines on pavements, where lines already exist, boots on asphalt. Radios murmuring to no one visible. A light arced across the seam as if the ground were a suspect. The board's porch lights glowed like theater spots. Curtains shifted, the small tremors of an audience that isn't sure they want to be seen seeing. I stood where my lawn met my walk because location conveys meaning. I was not on the street. I was not in anyone's way. I was at the edge of what was mine, precisely where a person belongs when someone else has tried to move that edge by force. They approached with the measured steps of people confident in a script. I could feel the version of me they'd been given, a problem. I could feel the version of them the board had invoked, a solution. Between those versions lay the seam. I lifted a hand, not a gesture of protest or permission, but a quiet invitation to look where the story was being told. In the soil, in the plat, in the sequence of letters that had turned from reminder to punishment to threat. The nearest flashlight paused on the underlayment I had rolled back. The beam steadied, then lowered, then steadied again. On the hood, the papers waited, tabs like flags, facts lined up with the indifference of gravity. Neighbors drifted closer to thresholds. Some leaned into doorframes, a posture of plausible deniability. One couple stood at the end of their walk, arms crossed not in hostility, but in self-protection. Somewhere, a dog started and stopped. The night held the kind of silence that amplifies small sounds. The click of a pen, the rustle of a page, the throat-clearing of someone who had expected an easier errand. The officer's shoulders shifted almost imperceptibly, the microscopic adjustments people make when the scene in front of them refuses to match the scene they were sent to. The radio on one belt crackled, a voice asking a question that could have been about anything and felt like it was about everything. Status. The beam traced the length of the seam again, then slid to the measurement I had left like a caption. I did not speak, not because I doubted my voice, but because the visuals spoke fluent truth. The certified envelope looked expensive on the hood and cheap next to the plat. The stakes ran true in two lines that could not both be right, and the distance between them measured an arrogance that had been easy to hide under grass. This is how intimidation loses its footing. Not with a shout, but with a diagram, not with a scene, but with a sequence. The board had planned for heat and found cool order. They had summoned authority and met accountability. The neighborhood, trained to flinch at volume, watched sense hold its ground. I could feel resolve move through the air, not mine, theirs. The people who had planted their weekends carefully to avoid fines now tracked the beam of a stranger's flashlight as if it could resurrect the idea of fairness. The people who had nodded through meetings suddenly had a picture to replace the speech. Images are harder to argue with than minutes. The nearest officer glanced toward the board president's porch. The president's posture held, a sculpture, even concern. The compliance chair's binder glinted in the porch light. A second flashlight joined the first over the trench, two circles of illumination overlapping into a single, brighter truth. I set the bagged samples at the edge, labels facing up, a lab report waiting to be read. The night smelled like soil and hot engine and the sweet metallic note of a neighborhood about to remember itself. I had expected confrontation to arrive, loud. Instead, it arrived like this, measured, close, unignorable. The rising action that had been 100 small paper cuts converged into one clean slice in the earth. The uniformed presence the board thought would end the story had become the audience for a story they couldn't edit. I stood still, heart steady now. The kind of steady that comes when you've run out of ways to pretend. If the ground is honest and the documents agree, fear becomes a habit you can set down. The flashlight beams lifted and crossed to the hood. Tabs were flipped. Pages found their places next to one another as if they had practiced. The officers' pens made small sounds in the margins of the night. The seam waited, the trench waited, the neighbors waited, the board waited. Everything that had been hidden had chosen a side, light. And on that light, the next move would sit. The engines idled gently, the neighborhood held its breath, and the moment balanced between what the board wanted to happen and what the facts were obligated to do. The rising had reached its crest. What came next would not be about who could play louder. It would be about who could stand closer to the truth without blinking. They came with more badges than questions. The evening had folded into a hush that made every small sound loom. The click of a radio, the whisper of shoes on pavement, the rustle of notes being flipped in a binder. Patrol lights painted hedges blue and made the maples bark look like bruised leather. I stood with my folder on the hood and my hands in the dirt-scratched pockets of a jacket I'd never thought I'd need for a backyard trial. Up close, the uniforms are ordinary, polished boots, badges that catch light like coins. Up close, they are also human, which means they can be led by a story as easily as any of us. The board had rehearsed one for them. I had rehearsed another. The lead officer approached. Polite but precise. The tone of someone who'd been briefed to expect compliance and to extend patience when it bought time. He wanted a narrative he could read into a report, dates, times, whether anyone got hurt. I offered him what I had. Not drama, paper, measurements, samples bagged with labels, photos with timestamps. The plat, the original survey, the certified letters. I set each item on the hood of my car with the care of someone arranging chess pieces. They needed to be seen in order, because order makes facts legible. He listened. He did not wave us both off. He did not tell me that the HOA had jurisdiction to move stones under a yard. He stood with the folder open, his pen hovering as if punctuation could be a jurisdictional line. Behind him, another officer kept watch. Behind them, as if summoned by the script the board had written, the compliance chair lingered at a respectful distance on her porch, eyes fixed like punctuation marks. The board president watched from the shadow of the community center, mouth a thin line. Their plan might have worked if I'd been alone with a photograph and a feeling. But I had witnesses, and witnesses make claims public. The lead officer started asking questions, not about how I dug, but about why. Why was I exposing the seam now? Who had I told? He spoke as if the decision would be made on motive, but motive is a story and stories shift. I answered with fact and avoided the moral tangents because the world's legal skeleton wants dates and ink and signatures. I recited the order of events like a prayer, the flyer, the letter, the first shovel, the seam, the calls, the certified envelope. Each item landed like a small stone on a table. The officer's pen moved but slower, the way a person's hand slows when something once assumed begins to doubt itself. Then the unexpected happened. Another car rolled up, not an official vehicle, not a board member's sedan, but a reporter's van. An older model with a university sticker and eyes behind a camera lens that had been curious before the board could cordon off the narrative. She stepped out, microphone at her side, polite and direct. "Is this what you found?" She asked, already focusing. I nodded and motioned. The first beam of light from a camera caught the trench and the seam and the hood full of tabbed documents. and made the whole scene look like evidence framed for a jury of more than neighbors. I didn't ask for attention. I hadn't planned the press. But once it arrived, the dynamic shifted. The board could no longer rely on polite nods in hallways. The presence of eyes that weren't part of their circle unmoored their authority. They had built consent in a bubble, and now the bubble had a camera lens poking holes in it. The board's response was immediate and aggressive in the way that practiced authority becomes when someone else's script invades the set. A complaint was read aloud by the compliance chair from the top step of the pavilion. I was conducting unauthorized excavation resulting in environmental and safety concerns. Her voice was steady, curated. Her binder gleamed. She suggested they had requested assistance to keep the peace. The word assistance had been chosen because it obscured the teeth behind it. The implication was law enforcement involvement to restore order, because the HOA had framed itself as guardian of safety. This was the peak they had hoped to manufacture, the board as anxious protector and me as errant violator. The audience leaned, some toward me, many toward whatever version of safety their fears had taught them. The officers looked between us, weighing the claims, my documented survey and the certified letters against complaints that could be read as concern. The treadmill of power runs on plausible deniability, and the board had polished that treadmill with a PR statement and a list of safety concerns. Then the lead officer did something that felt like a quiet mercy. He asked for details beyond the narrative and turned to the technicalities. Evidence matters in uniforms reports. He looked at the survey, then at the trench, then again at the survey. The seam and the plat did not speak in the language of rhetoric, they spoke coordinates and monuments. He called out one number from the plat and asked me to measure. I did. My tape unfurled, a physical argument between lines of ink, in the soft confidence of an unobtrusive machine. The numbers matched mine. The officer's smile, if you could call it that, was the small shift people make when the math refuses a story. At that point, the compliance chair tried to reclaim the aerial by raising a voice about community risk and precedent. Her words tried to fold the technical back into the emotional, as if feelings could reinstate the boundary the instruments had undercut. She invoked a phrase the board had used before, meant to scare. If you resist, we will escalate. The line was not subtle. It was an escalator sentence built to move people down into submission. One of the younger officers, one whose badge still sat high and bright on his chest like a new coin, listened to the phrase, and then toward the end, of the porch where the board sat, he leaned a little and asked quietly, Who escalated? The question was small, but surgical. The compliance chair's smile thinned. The board president's fingers tightened around a cup nobody could tell was warm. There was a sound, like a throat clearing, and then a pause long enough that a neighbor, in a bathrobe, could cross his arms and say simply, I heard them say they told officers to do what was necessary, even force. The words slid from his mouth like a small pebble into a pool and caused the first honest ripple of the night. Silence does not always mean consent. It often means calculus. The officers consulted with each other, a low thread of conversation that sounded like people measuring risk and paperwork. I watched them because the truth lived in the way they adjusted their weight on their boots, the incline of their heads when someone mentioned liability. The reporter's camera kept rolling, the red light a quiet metronome that marked how public we had become. Then, unexpectedly again, a voice rose, not from the board, not from the officers, but from the heart of the neighborhood. A woman who owned the house 3 doors down stepped forward, cardigan wrapped around her shoulders, estate papers folded in her hands. She had been silent for weeks, a reluctant neighbor who had paid her dues and kept her head down. Now she spoke with the bluntness that fear becomes when it's pushed too long. They told you to shoot if they resisted, she said, and the words hung as if they had been waiting for the right ear. There was no hyperbole in her voice. She had heard it. The reporter's pen stopped. The officers' faces moved through, a range from poker to concerned, then to official. If the board had intended the patrol cars to shore up their claim to authority, they had misread the human economy of escalation. Suggesting that law enforcement might use lethal force if resistance reached a threshold crosses a line beyond nuisance. It draws attention from administrators to prosecutors. It is a phrase that turns a neighborhood quarrel into a series of civil rights questions and possible criminal inquiries. The officers exchanged glances that were no longer merely procedural, they were tactical. I watched the compliance chair's face blanch. The board president spoke, voice quick and clipped. Those words were taken out of context. Someone from the board tried to reposition the meaning, to evacuate the phrase of the danger that had accompanied it. Recontextualization rarely works in real time. Language is a vessel. Once it pours into the public square, it cannot be easily siphoned back. The reporter asked for names and minutes, for phone records, for transcripts. The lead officer requested the same, with the procedural gravity of an investigator who recognizes the potential for escalation beyond a local infraction. The scene tightened into focus. I realized then that the board had traded petitions for a gambit they did not fully understand. The invocation of force. The neighborhood's fear had been their currency, and it had bought them influence up to the moment someone recorded an overzealous directive. It was the difference between a dictatorship of suggestions and a policy that could land a person in handcuffs, or worse. It was a difference now written into public domains because witnesses existed and cameras recorded, and the city's legal apparatus had a set of basic rules about public safety. The lead officer asked the compliance chair if she had documentation of such an instruction to law enforcement. Her answer, hesitation, then a throat-cleared, "We suggested assistance as warranted," was evasive. Suggested assistance is not directed lethal force. The distinction mattered to the officers who had signed up to protect, not to be enlisted as a blunt tool in managerial disputes. The investigators' questions widened from "what happened tonight" to "what were the communications over the last month" and "who instructed whom." A volunteer from the neighborhood, one of the men who'd been shy about confronting the board but steadfast in his backyard Saturdays, produced a recording. He had been at a meeting about compliance response and had, out of a cautious instinct, muted his phone ring but left the recorder running. He handed the device to the reporter, who queued it up. The thin broadcast of a meeting room sound, laughter, a cough, then a clipped voice saying, "If anyone resists, have the officers know they should use what's necessary." The audio played like a small, undeniable verdict. The room held and then broke into a new kind of noise. The board defending phrasing, the officers taking notes as if each syllable mattered, the neighbors murmuring as deniability evaporated. At that moment, the tone shifted drastically. The officers, who had arrived prepared to enforce the bedding down of an argument, now found themselves in the role of investigators. Paperwork no longer meant the end of a dispute. It meant the start of an inquiry. The lead officer stepped back, straightened his notes, and said what had been unspoken. "We'll need statements." The words were gentle, but final. The scene had changed from a display of force to a fact-finding operation. The board's podium, their porch, the pavilion, the community center, no longer projected immediate authority. It attracted scrutiny. The compliance chair now realized the cost of the words she, or one of her allies, had let loose in a moment of rhetorical heat. The board's plan to intimidate had introduced a variable they had not budgeted for, the possibility that their insistence on obedience could become a legal liability. The members looked at each other with the hollow surprise of people who thought of consequence as someone else's problem. I felt an odd relief wash over me, the kind that follows a long-held breath, finally exhaled. The trench on my property, the folders on the hood, the camera lens, the neighbor's trembling disclosure, they had combined into something the board could not simply smooth over with a notice and a fine. The officers were not my allies. Their job is to ascertain, not to pick sides. But by sitting with the facts and calling for statements, they had done something the board had not anticipated. They had made the dispute public and procedural. That night changed the neighborhood's internal economy. The board's armor, polite letters, fines, and rehearsed concern, revealed seams. The phrase that had been uttered in a meeting to suggest force if necessary became a thread that could unravel claims of benevolent governance. The officers collected statements from homeowners, took down the compliance chair's account, and asked to be provided with archived communications and meeting minutes. The reporter recorded everything, with the steady irreverence of someone who knows stories like this live or die on documentation. As the officers packed up and spoke about next steps, the board members' expressions altered from certainty to calculation. They were no longer the orchestrators of immediate compliance. They were potential subjects of inquiry. This is not private triumph. This is not revenge. This is, instead, an exposure. A system that had relied on private pressure to regulate a public living space had just been put under a light it could not control. The law is not the only thing that matters in these fights. Transparency does, too. And transparency has a way of bending power toward accountability. The night closed with a different kind of hush, one not of fear but of edges settling into new places. The officers left with requests, logs, recordings, names. The reporter promised follow-up. Neighbors lingered in clusters on porches and in driveways, voices low but not defeated. The board members retreated behind the gate and the gazebo as if to regroup. I stood in the middle of the seam I had exposed, fingers chalky with soil, heart steady, and a sense that the ground beneath my feet had done more than hold my house. It had held the truth long enough for someone to finally notice. But exposure is not resolution. The climb down from intimidation into inquiry creates plenty of questions that can leave a neighborhood raw. The board would regroup, try to reframe, attempt to reassert. Legal tides take time, and people grow weary. I had won a crucial moment, the turning point where intimidation met documentation and where suggestion met scrutiny, but the larger fight for what counted as fair governance, for what constitutes the legitimate use of power in a community, had only just begun. As the officers closed their notebooks and the reporter packed her camera, there was a sound like pages being closed across the block. The soil lay open where it had been peeled back, honest and mute. I knew the war wouldn't end with a single night, no matter how decisive. Battles carve maps, they don't redraw borders overnight. Still, as the last patrol car's taillights winked red and then were gone, I felt a clear, sharp truth settle in me. Some things are only changed by people, willing to unearth them, and once you put the truth in the light, it becomes much harder for anyone to pretend it wasn't ever there. The night did not promise immediate justice, only exposure. But exposure is a start, and starts can become movements. The next steps would be meetings, filings, lawyers, and perhaps painful reckonings. The question that hung in the warm air as I smoothed a bit of grass back over the edge was not whether I could win the war. No one knows that in advance. But whether enough people would choose truth over fear when it mattered most. The answer would reveal itself in the weeks to come, as neighbors decided whether to stand with their plat maps or with the complacency that lets power be exercised without question. The news spread faster than wildfire. The moment the first article hit the local paper, the HOA's carefully crafted image shattered into dust. What they had spent years trying to build, this illusion of authority, prestige, and control, was now exposed for what it really was: corruption, intimidation, and criminal abuse of power. And it wasn't just the newspaper. By evening, every local TV station had a van parked on the street. Reporters stood at the entrance of the neighborhood, cameras rolling, narrating the scandal that had rocked the community. The footage was brutal for the HOA. Shots of uniformed officers nervously shifting as reporters peppered them with questions. Neighbors whispering and pointing. Board members ducking behind closed blinds as journalists called out their names. And then came the bombshell video. Bodycam footage released after the sheriff's office completed their investigation. The public could now see it all. The HOA president giving her chilling command to the police, telling them to shoot if they resist. That single clip went viral. Within hours, it was trending on social media, replayed endlessly with captions calling out the HOA's abuse of power. The community that had once been afraid of them was now mocking them openly. Memes appeared, protest signs went up, and neighbors who had been silent finally found their voices. For me, though, the most satisfying moment wasn't the viral video or the news frenzy. It was the day the Attorney General's office announced formal charges. Fraud, abuse of authority, conspiracy, and even a civil rights violation. Every count was laid out like a hammer, striking down on those who thought they were untouchable. The HOA president, once smug and untouchable, was led away in handcuffs. The same officers who once followed her orders were now escorting her into custody. The sight of her broken expression was something the entire community would never forget. And what of the HOA itself? It collapsed. Members resigned overnight, terrified of legal consequences. The board was dissolved by court order. All of their finances, their secret accounts, their shady dealings, dragged out into daylight for everyone to see. Neighbors who had been bullied for years were now vindicated, and suddenly the entire community felt like it could breathe again. The fear that had once hung over every house, every street corner, evaporated. But perhaps the most powerful part of all was what came next. The yard I had dug up, the evidence I uncovered, became the very symbol of their downfall. What had once been just dirt and secrets was now the foundation of justice. People from the neighborhood came by, not to gawk, but to thank me. Families who had been too afraid to speak up shook my hand. Parents told me their kids could finally play outside without fear of harassment. Elderly neighbors who once lived in silence now walked freely, no longer worried about fines or threats. The sheriff himself visited me one evening. He told me that without my persistence, the truth might have stayed buried forever. He admitted something few officials ever would, that sometimes the system fails, and it takes ordinary people to hold it accountable. Looking back, I realized the conflict was never just about property lines, fines, or petty rules. It was about control. It was about how far a corrupt group would go to maintain power, and how far I was willing to go to stop them. The scars it left on the community would take time to heal, but healing had finally begun. And as for me, I stood in that same yard, where it all started, watching the sun set over a neighborhood that finally felt like home again. The grass would regrow, the soil would settle, but the story of what was unearthed there would never be forgotten. I didn't just dig up evidence. I dug up the truth. And in doing so, I buried the very system that tried to bury me. So I ask you, if it were your community, your home, your family under siege by those who think rules make them kings, would you have the courage to dig as deep as I did? Or would you let the dirt stay covered, knowing what might be festering beneath? Because sometimes the only way to expose the rot is to dig it up yourself.